It's kind of paradise to be here in summer with a bunch of other people who are trying to make art out of the language in their heads, and we're going to get to do it together for a couple of weeks. And none of us knows who is going to be the one to write the one paragraph or the one line or the one bit of dialogue that will bring tears to people's eyes for 2,000 years. But we get to be here. And in the evening, the reason I got lost was thinking about the fact that European painters spent 300 years between the 16th and 18th century trying to get right the look of sun on clouds that was out there. And we get to be in that company, the company of the people who try to do it, try to name it, keep the world alive that way. So I wish you all a great 2 weeks. I couldn't be happier or feel more privileged to be here. My friend Henry Rappaport suggested a good way to begin a first reading at a writers' conference was to read a poem called Envy of Other People's Poems. So this goes like this. In one version of the legend, the sirens couldn't sing. It was only a sailor's story that they could. So Odysseus, lashed to the mast, was harrowed by a music that he didn't hear. Plungings of sea, wind shear, the offshore hunger of the birds. And the mute women, gathering kelp for garden mulch, seeing him strain against the cordage, seeing the awful longing in his eyes, are changed forever on their rocky waste of island by their imagination of his imagination of the song they didn't sing. So each of us, the short version of that is our genius is our longing, and it takes the form of projection. When I was finishing the Time and Materials, the Iraq War was underway, and I was so sickened by it that I just found myself thinking about human beings and violence and the way we just do it over and over again. And this poem came out of that, but it's called Winged and Acid Dark. It comes from a remarkable book I was reading called A Woman's Journal, 8 Weeks in a Conquered City. It was written by a woman who's a travel writer in Berlin during the first 8 weeks after the collapse of the city and the Russian occupation of Berlin. It was published immediately after the war, and it was so embarrassing to the German people that it just disappeared. And the great German poet Hans Magnus Enzensberger tried for many years to get it published, and finally 2 years ago he started a publishing company to publish the book. It's been translated into English. The Russian soldiers arrived very angry in Berlin, and they systematically raped every woman, child, grandmother in the city repeatedly for 8 weeks until their commanders finally called them off. And she describes how people behaved and what happened in those 8 weeks. And one of the things that reminds you of is the fact that violence against women is not an accidental aspect of war. When you send people to war, soon as the military music starts getting played over the roiling tanks on Fox News, it should be in everybody's head, oh yeah, that means a lot of women are going to get raped. And a lot of innocent civilians are going to get killed. And my sickness during this period was just that knowledge, we can't seem to hang on to it long enough. Reading through the night and in the morning a sentence with the phrase dappled shadow in it. Something not sayable spurting from the morning silence, secret as a thrush. The other man, the officer who brought onions and wine and sacks of flour, the major with the swollen knee, wanted intelligent conversation afterward. Having no choice, she provided that too. Potsdamer Platz, May 1945. When the first one was through with her, he pried her mouth open. Basho told Rensetsu to avoid sensational materials in poetry. If the horror of the world were the truth of the world, he said, there would be no one to say it, and no one to say it to. I think he recommended describing the slightly frenzied swarming of insects near a waterfall. Pried her mouth open and spit in it. We pass these things on, probably because we are what we can imagine. Something not sayable in the morning silence, the mind hungering after likenesses, tenderness, tender sky, it wants to say, curves the swallows trace in air. Partly went to that poem because the only thing I've done recently is that connects to this theme is I got an invitation from editors of a new anthology of Anglo-Saxon poetry. They decided to get a bunch of contemporary poets to translate the whole body of Anglo-Saxon poetry. And remembering the Anglo-Saxon course that I almost flunked in graduate school, I thought, I could do this. The poem I picked when they offered it to me was The Battle at Brunanburh, which is the second to last poem. And I picked it because Tennyson translated it, did a thumping translation of it right around the same time that he wrote The Charge of the Light Brigade. And he made of it a poem of kind of Anglo-Saxon triumph. So I thought it would be interesting to have a conversation with Mr. Tennyson at this point. So this is the battle at Brunanburh. In that year, Aethelstan, Thane of Thanes, king, ring-giver, won great glory in a battle at Brunanburh with the blade of his sword. Also the Atheling, his younger brother Edmund. They broke the shield wall, hewed linden boards with sword edge hacked with hammered metal. They were the sons of Edward, Alfred's grandson. It suited their Saxon birth to spill the blood of a loathed foe, defending their lands, their homesteads, and hoard goods. They stove the enemy through. The Scotsmen and ship raiders fell as if fated. The fields soaked up blood from first light at morning when the Lord's star, the eternal Lord's bright candle, rose to glide over earth till it had gone to its rest, glorious being, and left behind bodies that spears had destroyed, bodies of Norsemen sprawled on their scutcheon, and the Scotsmen as well, exhausted and war-gorged. The men of Wessex harried them hard while the light lasted, herded in troops the fugitives fleeing before them, and slashed at them sorely with swords ground sharp. Nor did the Mercians refuse hard hand play to any of the foe who turned to face them. From among the warriors who had followed Anlaf over the sea surge, Anlaf was the guy who they were fighting, over the sea surge, who came from Dublin on a raid against a place near Kent, who had followed Anlaf over the sea surge, crouched in the ship's breast to seek out the land they were fated to die in. 5 lay dead on the field of battle, young kings, the sword put to sleep, and another 7 of Anlaf's earls, and an untold number of shipmen and Scots. And they sent fleeing the Norseman's chief. Knee drove him to the ship's prow with what remained of his people. They pushed out on the tide, took the king out on the fallow flood tide, and that saved his life. Constantinus, in that same way, the Scotsman who schemed with the Vikings to raid the Anglo-Saxons. Constantinus, in the same way, fled the fighting, that crafty man home to his north country. The hoary old soldier had nothing to sing of. The clash of weapons had robbed him of kinsmen, of friends who fell at the field of battle, slain in the strife. He had left his own son, young to the sword, on that slaughtering ground, wounded and maimed. Not much for the graybeard to sing praise of in that sword work, the old fraud. nor for Anlaf either, with his army lost no reason to laugh that they were the better in deeds of war, in collision of banners on the battlefield, in the spear thrusts, the meeting of men and trading of blows, when in that blood test they played with the offspring of Edward. So the Northmen departed in their nailed ships, sad leavings of spears, and shamed in their spirits they sailed from Dingismere over deep waters, seeking Dublin Bay again in Ireland. In the same way, the brothers, both together, the king and the prince, sought out their kin in the West Saxon lands, wild with their winnings. They left behind a scattering of corpses for the dark ones, for the black raven with its horned beak, and for the dusky eagle with its white back, for that greedy war hawk, a carrion feast, and for the gray wild beast, the wolf in the woods. There was never more killing on this island, never before so many cut down by the sword's edge, never so many bodies, the old books say, the wise old rememberers, not since Angles and Saxons came from the east over the brimming sea, looking for Britain, and bold men, warsmiths eager for glory, smashed the Welshmen and battened on this earth. So that's Anglo-Saxon. It started to sound to me like Quentin Tarantino as I was doing it, which I thought seemed about right for the just incredible violence of our origins. This is the last or second to last poem in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, and it rhymes a bit. There's no rhyme in Anglo-Saxon. The last two poems, both elegies for sons of this Edward who won this other battle. Poems begin to rhyme, and then that dialect, Anglo-Saxon, the French came, it disappears, and the next thing you get, the beginnings of whatever our language is. This is one of them. I didn't try to rhyme it. Charles Martin probably could have done it, but it was beyond me to try to get what was going on. Chronicles, the death of Alfred. Little prose beginning. 1036. In this year, Alfred, innocent prince, son of King Ethelred, came into the country and wished to go to his mother, who was living at Winchester, but Godwin did not permit him to do this, nor the other barons, because, wrong as it was, sentiment had swung to Harold. They wanted Alfred's pelt. So Godwin seized the young prince and put him in prison, destroyed the retinue, found various ways to kill them. Some were sold for cash, some cut down cruelly, some put in fetters, some were blinded, some hand-strung, and some of them scalped. No bloodier deed was ever done in this land, not since the Danes came and made peace here. Now it's to be believed that the hands of God have put those men in bliss with Jesu Christ, for they were guiltless and wretchedly slain. The prince was kept alive, set about by every evil, until, under advisement, they led him, as they had bound him, to Ely in the fens. As soon as he landed, he was blinded. Right there on shipboard and blinded, he was brought to the good monks, and he dwelled there as long as he lived. And afterwards he was buried, as befitted him very worthily, for he was a worthy man, at the west end of the chapel, very near the steeple, under the church porch. His soul is with Christ. Last little poem, first elegy, really, in the English language. Anyway, back to the beginning of the Iraq War. This is a poem called, not on the subject exactly, but you'll see. This is a poem called I Am Your Waiter Tonight, and My Name is Dimitri. I am your waiter tonight, and my name is Dimitri, is more or less the title of a poem by John Ashbery, and has no investment in the fact that you can get an adolescent of the human species to do almost anything. And when adolescence in the human species ends is what the fat man in the Maltese Falcon calls a nice question, sir, a very nice question indeed. Which is why they are tromping down a road in Fallujah in combat gear in 115 degrees of heat this morning, and why a young woman is strapping 20 pounds of explosives to her mortal body in Jerusalem. Dulce et decor est pro patria mori. Have I mentioned that the other law of human nature is that human beings will do anything they see someone else do, and someone will do almost anything? There is probably a waiter in this country so clueless he wears a t-shirt in the gym that says, Dmitri. Not our protagonist. American amnesia is such that he may very well be the great-grandson of the elder Karamazov brother who fled to the Middle West with his girlfriend Grushenka. He never killed his father. It isn't true that he killed his father. But his religion was that woman's honey-colored head, an ideal tangible enough to die for, and he lived for it in Buffalo, New York, or Sandusky, Ohio. He never learned much English, but he slept beside her in the night until she was an old woman who still knew her way to the Russian pharmacist in a Chicago suburb where she could buy sachets of the herbs of the Russian summer that her coarse white nightgown smelled of as he fell asleep, though he smoked Turkish cigarettes and could hardly smell. Grushenka got 2 boys out of her body. One was born in 1894, the other in 1896. The elder having died in the mud at the Battle of the Somme from a piece of shrapnel manufactured by Alfred Nobel. Metal traveling at that speed works amazing transformation on the tissues of the human intestine. The other son worked construction the year his mother died. If they could have, they would have, if not filled, half filled her coffin with the petals of buckwheat flowers from which Crimean bees made the honey bought in the honey market in St. Petersburg, not far from the place where Raskolnikov, himself an adolescent male, couldn't kill the old money lender without killing her saintly sister, but killed her nevertheless in a fit of guilt and reasoning which went something like this. Since the world evidently consists in the ravenous pursuit of wealth and power and in the exploitation and prostitution of women, except the holy self-sacrificing ones who make you crazy with guilt, and since I am going to be the world, I might as well take an axe to the head of this woman who symbolizes both usury and the guilt the virtue and suffering of women induces in men, and be done with it. I admit the syntax of that sentence, like the intestines slithering from the hands of the startled boys clutching their belly wounds at the psalm, has escaped my grip. I step over it gingerly. Where were we? Not far from the honey market, which is not far from the hay market. It's important to remember that the teeming cities of the 19th century were site central for horsewhipping. Humans had domesticated the race of horses some 10 centuries before, harnessed them, trained them, whipped them mercilessly for recalcitrants in Vienna, Prague, Naples, London, and Chicago, according to the novels of the period, which may have been noticing this for the first time or registering an actual statistical increase in either human brutality or the insurrectionary impulse in horses, which were fed hay. So there was, of course, in every European city a hay market, like the one in which Raskolnikov kissed the earth from a longing for salvation. Grushenka, though Dostoevsky made her, probably did not have much use for novels of ideas. Her younger son, a master carpenter, eventually took a degree in engineering from Bucknell University. He married an Irish girl from Vermont who was descended from the gardener of Emily Dickinson, but that's another story. Their son in Iwo Jima died, gangrene, but he left behind, curled in the body of the daughter of a Russian Jewish cigar maker from Minsk, the fetal curl of a being who became the lead dancer in the Cleveland Ballet, Radiant Tanya, who turned in a bad knee early in 1971, just after her brother died at Khao Dai Diem, for motherhood, which brings us to our waiter, Dmitri, who, you will have noticed, is not in Baghdad. He doesn't even want to be an actor. He's been offered roles in several major motion pictures and refused them because he is, in fact, under contract to John Ashbery, who's a sane and humane man and has no intention of releasing him from the poem. You can get killed out there. He is allowed to go home for his mother's birthday, and she is described to him on the phone. It's a cell phone. He's walking down Christopher Street with such easy bearing. He could be St. Christopher bearing innocents across a river, having come across a lock, the delicate curl of a honey-colored lock of his great-grandmother's Crimean honeybee pollen, Russian spring wildflower sachet-scented hair in the attic, where it released for her in the July heat and raftery midsummer dark the memory of an odor like life itself carried to her on the wind. Here is your sea bass with a light lemon and caper sauce. Here is your dish of raspberries and chocolate. Notice the subtle transformation of the colors of excrement and blood. And here, Earth's apotheosis are the flecks of crystallized lavender that stipple it. So those are my war poems. And I'll go to newer poems. This is a group of poems I've at the moment called August Notebook of Death. Started writing, keeping monthly notebooks. So I have 12 of them. And when July ended, I got out the August notebook and I just started adding to it. So I'm going to see what happens over 4 or 5 years. So this one is August Notebook of Death. First poem is called River Bicycle Peony. Comes from a remark in C.D. Wright's American Notebook, in which he says sometimes a poet just wants to say river bicycle peony. And this beginning of this poem involves a visual typo, so I can't quite do it. I woke up thinking about my brother's body. That was my first bit of early morning typing. So the first dignity, it turns out, is to get spelling right. I woke up thinking about my brother's body. Apparently, it's at the medical examiner's morgue. I found myself wondering whether he's naked yet, and whose job it was to take clothes off. And when they did it, it seemed unnecessary to undress his body until they performed the exam, and that's going to happen later this morning. And so I found myself hoping that he was dressed still, though smell may be an issue, or hygiene. When the police do a forced entry for the purpose of a welfare check and the deceased person is alone, the body goes to the medical examiner's morgue in the section for those deaths in which no evidence of foul play is involved, so the examination for cause of death is fairly routine. 2 policemen, for some reason I imagine they were young, found my brother. His body was in the bed, which was a mattress on the floor. He was lying on his back, according to Angela, my brother's friend, who lives nearby and is schizophrenic and always introduces herself as my brother's personal assistant. And he seemed peaceful, she said. There would have been nothing in the room but the mattress and a microwave, an ashtray, I suppose, cartons and food wrappers he hadn't thrown away, and the little plastic prescription bottles that he referred to as his scripts. They must have called the medical examiner's office, the 2 policemen, and that was probably a team of 3. When I awoke, I visualized this narrative, but I thought it would be shorter. I thought that what would represent my feelings would be the absence of metaphor. But then, at the 3rd line, I discovered that I could make of this account a 3-line stanza, and that it was going to be the second dignity. So I imagine he is in one of those aluminum cubicles I've seen in the movies, dressed or not. I also imagine that if they undressed him and perhaps washed his body and gave it an alcohol rug to disinfect it, that was the job. There's a small gender shift at this point in the operation of some immigrant woman from a hot, poor country. Anyway, he is dressed in this stanza, which mimics the terzarima of Dante's comedy, and is a form Wallace Stevens liked to use, and also my dear friend Robert. And anyway, seemed peaceful is a metaphor. The next poem is called Sudden and Grateful Memory of Mississippi John Hurt. Because I woke again thinking of my brother's body and why anyone would care in some future that poetry addresses how a body is transferred from the medical examiner's office, which is organized by local government and issues a certificate establishing that the person in question is in fact dead and names the cause or causes, to the mortuary or cremation society, most of which are privately owned businesses and run for profit, and until recently tended to be family businesses with skills and decorums passed from father to son, and often quite ethnically specific in a country like ours made from crossers of borders. as if in the intimacy of death, some tribal shame or squeamishness or sense of propriety asserted itself so that the Irish buried the Irish and the Italians, the Italians. In the South, in the early years of the last century, it was the one business in which a black man could grow wealthy and pass on a trade and a modicum of independence to his children. I know this because my friend Judith wrote a piece about it for which she interviewed fourth-generation African-American morticians in Oakland whose grandfathers and great-grandfathers had buried the dead in cotton towns on the Delta and along the Brazos River in Texas, passing on to their children who had gone west an order of doing things and symbolic forms of courtesy for the bereaved and sequences of behavior at wakes and funerals, so that, for example, the eldest woman in the maternal line entered the chapel first, and what prayers were said, and in what order. During Prohibition, they even sold the white lightning to the men who were allowed to slip outside and take a nip and talk about the dead while the cries and gospel song-voiced contralto moans of grief that could sound curiously like elation rose inside. Also, the rules for burial and burning, griefs and rituals, and inside them, cosmologies. And I thought of Mississippi John Hurt's great song about Lewis Collins and its terrible tenderness, which can't be reproduced here because so much of it is in the picking of the six-string guitar and in his sweet, reedy old man's voice. And when they heard that Lewis was dead, all the women dressed in red. The angels laid him away. They laid him 6 feet under the clay. The angels laid him away. Third poem. You can fall a long way in sunlight. You can fall a long way in the rain. The ones who don't take the old white horse take the evening train. When you go down into the city of the dead, with its whitewashed walls and winding alleys and avenues of autumnal lindens and the heavy bells tolling by the sea, crowds appear in all directions, having left their benches and tiered plazas, lying aside their occupations of reverie and gossip and the memory of breathing to hear what scraps of news they can from this world, where the air is thin at high altitudes and smells of pine, and of almost perfect density in valleys, where trees on summer afternoon sometimes throw violet shadows across sidewalks. Only the arborist in the park never stirs for the new arrivals. He's not incurious, but he has his work to do. It's he who decides which limbs get lopped off in the city of the dead. You can fall a long way in sunlight. You can fall a long way in the rain. The ones who don't take the old white horse take the evening train. Last of these poems. Today his body is consigned to the flames, and I begin to understand why people would want to carry a body to the river's edge and build a platform of wood and burn it in the wind and scatter the ashes in the river, as if to say, take him, fire, take him, air, and river, take him, downstream, downstream. Watch the ashes disappear in the fast water, or in a small flaring of anger, turn away, walk back toward the markets and the hum of life, not quite saying to yourself there, the hell with it, it's done. I said to him once, when he'd gotten into some scrape or other, you know, you have the impulse control of a ferret. And he said, yeah, I don't know what a ferret is, but I know I get greedy. I don't mean to, but I get greedy. Old grubber's beard going gray, a wheelchair, sweats, street person's baseball cap. I've been thinking about Billie Holiday, he said. You know, if she were around now, she'd be nothing. You know what I mean? See, hip-hop, never. She had to be born at a time when they were writing the kind of songs and people were listening to the kind of songs. She was great at singing. And I would say, you just got evicted from your apartment, you can't walk, and you have no money, so I don't want to talk to you about Billie Holiday right now, okay? And he would say, you know, I'm like Mom. I mean, she really had a genius for denial, don't you think? And the thing is, you know, she was a pretty happy person, and I would say she was not a happy person. She was panicky. She was crippled by guilt from her drinking. She was evasive to herself about herself, so she couldn't actually connect with anybody, and her only defense was to be chronically cheerful. And he would say, worse things than cheerful. Well, I am through with those arguments, except in my head, and not through, I see, with the habit. I thought this poem would end downriver, of worrying about where you are and how you're doing. So that's the August poem, Elegies for My Brother. And this is I thought I would finish with the September notebook, which is called Stories. And this is still a process. I've allowed myself not to decide whether this is a series of individual poems with notes in between or whether it's one long poem. Everyone comes here from a long way off is a line from a poem I read last night. Everything else would be examples. For example, driving up 80 in the haze, they talked and talked. Smoke in the air simmering from fires. His story was sad. Hers was roiled, troubled. Is that enough? A man, a woman, and the summer fires? Alternatively, there is the hunger for pattern, a Borgesian double mirror. A man and a woman, old friends, are in a theater watching a movie in which a man and a woman, old friends, are driving through summer on a mountain road. The woman is describing the end of her marriage and sobbing, shaking her head and laughing and sobbing. The man is watching the road, listening, his own more diffuse unhappiness in abeyance. And because in the restaurant before the movie, the woman had been describing the end of her marriage and cried, they are not sure whether they in the theater or on the mountain road, and when the timber truck comes suddenly to the bend, they both flinch. Or, he found that it was no good trying to tell what happened that day. Everything he said seemed fictional the moment that he said it. The rain, the scent of her hair, what she said as she was leaving, and why it was important for him to explain that the car had been parked under eucalyptus on a hillside, and how velvety and blurred the trees looked through the windshield. Not, he said, that making fictions might not be the best way at getting at one's experience, but that nothing he said had that brute, abject, unassimilated quality of a wounding. The ego in any telling was already seeing itself as a character. Let me back up, get the rhythm of that right. Not, he said, that making fictions might not be the best way of getting at an experience, but that nothing he said had the brute, abject, unassimilated quality of a wounding. The ego in any telling was already seeing itself as a character, and a character, he said, was exactly what he was not at that moment, even as he kept wanting to explain to someone, to anyone who would listen, that she had closed the door so quietly and so firmly that the beads of rain on the side window didn't even quiver. The names for involuntary movements of the body, squirm, wince, flinch, quiver, and shudder, sound like a law firm in Dickens. Mr. Flinch took off his black gloves as if he were skinning his hands. Quiver dipped the nib of his pen into the throat of the inkwell. The receptionist at the hospital morgue told him to call the city medical examiner's office, but you only got a recorded voice on weekends. Set up without the punchline. 3 greenhorns are being measured for suits by a very large tailor in a very small room on Hester Street. Once there were two sisters named Knock Me and Sock Me. Their best friend was a bear called Always Arguing. What kind of animals were the sisters? One child asked. Once there were two sisters named Knock Me and Sock Me. Their best friend was a bear called Always Arguing. What kind of animals were the sisters? One child asked. Maybe they could be raccoons, said the other. Or pandas, said the first. They could be pandas. Why, he asked. Because she was lonely and angry, said the friend who knew her better. And she'd run out of stories or come to the one story. It is good to sit down to birthday cake with children because they think it is the entire point of life and therefore respect each detail of the ceremony. There ought to be a rule, he thought, for who gets to lick the knife that cuts the cake, and the rule should have its pattern somewhere in the winter's stars. Which do you add to the tea first, he'd asked, the sugar or the milk? And the child had said instantly, the milk. Laws as cool and angular as words. Angular, sidereal. Stories about the distribution of wealth. Once upon a time, there was an old man and an old woman who were very, very poor. Origin stories. Here's the one about the day that Eldie told us how she got her name. The neighborhood had been so dangerous, she said. There was one summer when the mailmen refused to deliver the mail. Her mother never appeared, and her grandmother, who had bought a handgun for protection and had also taught her how to use it, would walk her to the post office for the sweet, sing-song, half-rhymed letters that smelled, or that she imagined smelled, of Florida. She had, when she was 10, shot at an intruder climbing in the window. The roar, she said, was tremendous, and she doesn't know to this day whether she shot the man or not. Big-boned young woman, skin the color of the inside of some light-colored hazelnut confection, auburn eyes, some plucked string of melancholy radiating from her whole body when she spoke. Did your mama come back? They had asked. She never came back. The mail started up again, but the letters stopped. Turned out she was good in school, and that was what saved her. She loved the labor of schoolwork, loved finishing a project and contemplating the neatness of her script. Her grandmother shook her head sometimes, amused and proud, and called her Little Diligence. And that was how Eldie got her name. He was told to be as careful as he could about cars entering from the right. So he walked the path watchfully and was run over by a car coming in from the left. Punchline without the setup. And the three nuns from Immaculate Conception nodded and smiled as they passed because they thought he was addressing them in Latin. Quests. He had known as long as he had known anything that he had a father somewhere. When he was 12, his mother told him why he had no shadow. Consequences. Because she, not her sister, answered the door, she was the first to hear the news. Ballads. He loved to watch that woman sew. She let her hair grow long for show. Riddles and needle, a refrain might go, and plainly said, is thread. She looked beautiful and looked her age, too. She'd had a go at putting herself together. She'd always had the confidence that with a face like hers, a few touches to represent the idea of a put-together look would do, like some set designer's genius minimalism. It had a slightly Harridan effect, and he remembered that it wasn't what was headlong or slapdash about her, but the way they gestured like a quotation at an understanding of elegance it would have been boring to spell out, that had at first dazzled her for him. He felt himself stirring at this recognition and a certain memory that attended it, and then laughed at the thought that he had actually stimulated himself sexually with an analysis of her style. And she said, as if she were remembering the way he could make her insecure, "What? What are you smiling about?" And he said, "Nothing." And she said, "Oh, yeah, right, I remember nothing." Two jokes walked into a bar. A cage went in search of a bird. Three rabbis walk into a penguin. A boy walks out in the morning with a gun. A woman, a man, and the summer fires. There's no end to telling. In the other world, the girls were named Eleanor and Felina, and one night it was very warm, and they could not sleep for the heat and the stillness, and they went outside beyond the wall of their parents' garden and into a meadow. It was dark, moonless, and the stars were so thick they seemed to shudder, and the sisters stood a long time in the sweet smell of the cooling grasses, looking at the sky and listening in the silence. After a while, they heard a stirring and saw that a pair of bright eyes was watching them from the wood's edge. "Maybe it's their friend the bear," one of the children said. "I don't like this story," said the other. "There is no end to the telling. You had an affair with a literary agent named Faith," she said. "A sort of affair," he said. "And?" she said. "And," he said, "it didn't work out, really." Or they could be pandas. A cage went in search of a bird. There is no end to the telling. A man, a woman, and the summer fires. So that's the condition of that at present. Read for the fiction writers and the playwrights here as well as the poets. So I'll finish with a poem called For Miloš and After Coleridge, late July. I spent 20 years or more working with Czesław Miłosz on the translation of his poems. He was my neighbor in the Berkeley Hills, and we fell into a pattern. When I got to know him in the middle 1970s, he had been writing poetry for 45 years, and he lived to write for another 25 or so. We would meet on Monday mornings, and sometimes he wanted to do new poems, like so often wanted to do old poems to see what was there, and he would do a first translation, and we would sit down and go to work on the poems. And so I had a lot of time to think about his work. This poem is after Coleridge, because Coleridge in 1789 had gout, and he couldn't go for a walk with his friend Charles Lamb, and his friend William Wordsworth. Lamb had come up from London, and Coleridge had a crush on Wordsworth's fiance's sister, and the four of them went off without him. So he stayed home and wrote a poem imagining their walk called "This Lime Tree Bower, My Prison." I didn't go hiking with the others this morning on the dusty trail past the firehouse, past the massive, asymmetrical, vanilla-scented Jeffrey pine, among the spikes of buckbrush and the spicy sage and the gray-green ceanothus, listening to David's descriptions of the terrifying efficiencies of a high mountain ecosystem, the white fir's cost-benefit analysis of the usefulness of its lower limbs, the ants herding aphids. They store the sugars in the aphids' rich excretions on the soft green mesas of a mule ear leaf. I think of the old man's dark study jammed with books in 7 languages as the headquarters of his military campaign against nothingness. There's immense egoism in writing, of course, the narcissism of some wound, but actual making, actual work. One of the things he believed was that our poems could be better than our motives. So who cares why he wrote those lines about the hairstyle of his piano teacher in Vilno in the 1920s, or the building with spumy Baroque cornices that collapsed on her in 1942? David and the others would have reached the waterfall by now. There were things he could not have known as he sat beside her on the mahogany bench, that he could only have seen or recomposed, remembering the smell of her powder as a 65-year-old man on another continent, looking out a small window at the early spring rain. Things he could only remember as a 65-year-old man on another continent looking out a small window at an early spring rain. That if she taught piano, she was an artistic girl. That she didn't have family money. That she must have dreamed once of performing and discovered the limits of her gift. And that her hair, piled atop her head and thickly braided, wound about her beautifully shaped skull, which the boy with his worn sheaf of Chopin etudes would hardly have noticed, was formed by some bohemian raffishness in the style of her music student youth, so that he, the poet at the outer edges of middle age with what comes after visible before him, could think unbidden of her reddish belle epoque hair and its powdery faint scent of apricot that he had not noticed, and of the hours she must have spent, thousands in a lifetime, braiding her hair, thinking that I'm sorry, I've got this. Let me get this long sentence. Could think unbidden of her reddish belle epoque hair and its powdery faint scent of apricot that he had not noticed, and of the hours she must have spent, thousands in a lifetime, tending to her braids, and think that the young himself then, with his duties and resentments, are always walking past some already perished dream of stylishness or beauty that survives or half survives in the familiar and therefore tedious, therefore anonymous outfitting of one's elders, and that her gentility would have required the rain in green California may have let up a little and quieted to dripping in the firms, required the smallest room in the most expensive quarter of the city she could manage. He'd have recalled the rows of yellow bindings of French novels on her well-dusted shelves, the one that all educated young people had. And this was why he visited her in that gleaming parlor room on the street of St. Peter of the Rock, and why he would hear years later in a letter from a classmate, the stone that crushed her was not concrete or the local limestone, but pure chunks of white, carefully quarried Carrara marble. Something in him must have identified with the darkness he thought he was at war with. It made him a child holding its breath as a form of power, a threat, but against whom, to extort what? It made him a lover perfecting a version of the silent treatment from some strategy of anticipatory anger at the failure of love. So he may have had to rouse himself against the waste, against the vast stupidity and cruelty and waste and wasted pathos, to hear the music in which to say that he had noticed after all the years that her small body had been crushed expensively. One summer, by that waterfall, I saw a hummingbird, a calliope, hovering and glistening above the water spray and the hemlock, then dropping down into it and rising and wobbling and beating its furious wings and dropping again and rising and glistening. The others should be there by now. And it's possible the bird is back this year. They'd have made their way down the dusty trail and over the ledge of granite to the creek's edge and to that cascade of spray. Thanks. Thank you very much.